Welcome, everybody, to another edition of the .NET Foundation Project Spotlight. I'm Isaac Levin, member of the Marketing Committee. I have Simon Cropp with me today to talk about his project Verify. Simon, do you want to say hello, introduce yourself?
Yep, hi everyone, and thanks for having me. Yep, my name's Simon Cropp. I'm a software developer over in Australia. Um, and we're talking about Verify, which is my snapshot testing library that I've been working on for a few years now.
That's great. So tell me a little bit, maybe think of me as a .NET developer who maybe I've been building apps for a while. Testing probably isn't my most favorite thing to do. So what can Verify do for me to make my life a bit easier?
So it happens in several factors. The first one is it makes your assertion code much simpler. Instead of, say, you've got an object that you're asserting and you want to assert the various different states of that multiple properties and everything on there. With assertion testing, it might be, 10 different lines of assertion code. If you have a loop, you might need to loop through and assert that all of those things are correct in a list. Maybe things contain items. So your assertion code gets quite complex. With snapshot testing, you can pass any given instance of a .NET object to the snapshot testing library, and it will serialize that to a file, and then that is what you assert against in the future. So the first time you verify that file, it writes it to disk, and that's becomes the representation of what should be in the future. So it simplifies getting started with your assertions because it instantly shows you what it looks like now, and you get to choose if that's correct. And moving forward, any test run in the future, that data is verified and compared against the existing snapshot. And the snapshot gets checked into source control, so you have a history over time of what the data looks like for a given test.
That's really interesting. So, maybe I'm just going to summarize kind of what you said. Say, for instance, I have, a simple test that's maybe checking the values coming from an API, right? I know what those values are always going to be, and sometimes, so typically, I'll hard code what those values are supposed to be. But what Verify can do for me is to actually have like a managed, I guess, correct value to do my assertions against. Is that a fair assessment?
It manages the correct result of the outputs of that API call.
That's
So you
okay.
still need to do the arrange and the act, but the assert part is effectively automated for you.
That's great. I mean, as somebody who is a .NET developer and writing tests are, kind of one of the last things that we do. It's one of those things that any tool that can make my life easier in the testing space. I'd like to know a little bit about the origin of Verify. So, what kind of led you down this path of creating, kind of a tool to, empower people when they're building out their tests?
So the genesis of the project was a project called Approval Tests by Llewellyn Falco. I was a co-maintainer of the .NET variant of that for quite a few years. It's been around for a long time and it's heavily used. One of the things I found with that is with approval tests is it was written at the time when everything was attribute driven. So you think back to the early days of .NET, and your test libraries, and still to a certain extent now, are driven by attribute driven. Everything's statically compiled, and you walk through those attributes, and that works, but it's not expressive enough. So if you look through what testing frameworks are doing now, and even APIs in general, they're often taking fluent APIs to configure things or expressions to configure things. So we've evolved beyond that static attribute-driven approach because you very quickly hit the limitations of what attributes can provide. So that was one of the things I decided to fork something else out of. Also, Approval Test has a significant user base, and one of the tenets of Approval Test is it helps you test legacy code. So it's one of the things it really wants to help you with. And as part of that, you get that into your mindset, and that project really avoids making breaking changes, because if you are testing legacy code, It's one of the things you want to avoid. You want to avoid forcing people to move forward and break um, existing testing frameworks. So there was just too much history there. And I had to fork out my learnings from that project and come up with something new from scratch. And it was effectively from scratch. Um, it was a new rewrite where each of the concepts in approval tests I took and reapplied based on, you know, more modern learnings of how APIs should be written.
That's really interesting. I mean, so obviously, going from something like Brutal Test, like you mentioned, kind of has multi-language support, right? Even in the .NET world, like we're talking, from a paradigm perspective, tons of different ways people write APIs, tons of different testing frameworks. So, what has been one of the biggest challenge for you as you've continually had to, make sure it works for this new version of .NET, make sure it works for this new hot testing framework that's come out. What has kind of been some of the challenges that you've had?
But making work for new versions of .NET wasn't too much of a hassle. That wasn't a main blocker. Getting it to work in a seamless way with each of the different testing frameworks was quite complex. And I think the challenge there is that at a top level, writing a test in each of the different testing frameworks, you can map that across and look at the code, and they look fairly similar. But the extensibility model of each of the different testing frameworks in .NET is radically different under the covers because it's not an API that's commonly used. It's not an API that's commonly publicized. So I think that different testing libs have been much more like the maintainers, so much more free to evolve how the extensibility model works in the different testing libraries. So how they share the current state of tests, or even if they do share the current state of tests, how you plug in and manipulate and get the data out of a context, how you force something to fail. So that was quite a challenge. There is some reflection code for some of the test frameworks where it's insider knowledge where I've only able to write that since I've had a look at how the internal workings of those test frameworks work. So, for instance, XUnit 3 is coming out hopefully in the next few months. And I'm certain I'll have to do some more research on how to get that to work. So that's been a bit of a challenge. And another challenge I had was I recently added support for Expecto, which is a test framework targeting F#. And it's completely different to all the other test frameworks, both from not just the extensibility model, but how you even write tests. So it's functional first, ignore what other testing frameworks have done and write something that works the best for how people code in F#. So that was a significant challenge. But yeah, I got it working in the end with some caveats, but yeah, it's probably the main challenges to it.
Yeah, no, I could imagine. I imagine primarily what you've been doing is C#, right? So
Yeah.
maybe even to an expect like maybe is there VB support uh, for Verify at this point or no?
Yes. So
Yeah.
it is purely .NET. There's nothing C# specific about it. It is written in C#. So you can consume. So Verify supports MS Test, NUnit, XUnit, and Expecto in terms of test libraries. And you can consume any of those from C#, VB, F#, or any other .NET language. So there are people who are using XUnit in F# and are using the Verify XUnit library in F#. And there are some people who are doing VB stuff as well.
Yeah, I mean, I can't even think of a situation where managing not just one but two but three different languages, right? Like, and making sure that the paradigms exist, especially when you're going from C#, VB to F#, right? I'd imagine that you might have had some help along the way, right? Have you had anybody kind of give you some some pointers on how functional testing should really be written and things like that, or was it a lot of just waiting for the community to respond negatively to it?
I had a few people prompt me to do the better F# support both in Expecto and in the XUnit one. and I did get a lot of pointers from the community. They were very helpful in, both getting me up to speed with F Sharp enough that I could write samples, providing me hints, and walking me through how Expecto works. So they were quite helpful in getting that up and running. VB is close enough to C# in like the paradigm. It's still primarily object oriented, and it's not a paradigm shift as to what F# is. So it's not much of an issue. It just works. And also, people who are coding in VB seem to have become comfortable with reading samples in C# and making that work in VB. So I have samples for documentation samples for F# and C#. I haven't gone down the VB path yet.
That's awesome. I mean, so I'm glad to hear the community saw Verify as something that could empower all .NET developers, right? So, if people go and take a look at the GitHub page or the GitHub repo for it, like you've had some contributors, you're fairly active in there, right? So, like, what's next for Verify?
Well, next I've done a bit of testing with .NET 6. It's meant to be out in, I think, November, but I don't know, maybe they're planning on dropping it sooner and looking at some of the stuff I was saying coming out. And making sure it works with .NET 6 will be an important thing to work on. But also getting it to work on different operating systems better as well. So the core library works on Linux, Mac, and Windows, but there's a secondary step, which is management of the snapshot files, and that works best on Windows, okay on Mac, and I haven't really done that much testing on Linux. So I need to go through and make sure all that works. And when I say the snapshot management, one of the things with snapshot testing is when you have a difference in a file, you want to effectively compare that. So Verify plugs into about 20 different diff tools. So when you say you serialize person and the name changes, you have a difference between the accepted snapshot and the one that you currently have. So when that happens, you'll get a diff tool pop up. So something like Beyond Compare or any other diff tool that you have installed, it'll detect it for you, and it will highlight the difference for you. And that works okay for one snapshot, for one change. You can manually accept that in the snapshot tool, or you can manually rename the file on disk. But that gets very cumbersome very quickly when you're managing many different snapshot files over and over, and you want to iterate quickly. So there's a few different ways that you can automate that process. One is a clipboard approach, where it will put, when a snapshot fails, it will put the command to accept that snapshot change into your clipboard. So if it fails, the diff engine pops up, you look at it, and then you just right-click the command in the console and paste, and it'll accept that file for you. Eventually, it's just a move command. There's also the approach in both Rider and Visual Studio, if you're using ReSharper or Rider, where you can right-click on the failed test and do accept snapshot. So that's an extension to Rider and ReSharper that understands how Verify works. So the JetBrains guys supplied that. And there's the other way is there's a tray tool that runs on Windows, and it monitors all the different snapshot failures and successes on your computer across multiple solutions, and then it groups them in a UI down in your tray where you can right-click and accept different files, or you can bind different things to keyboard commands. So on Windows, all of those approaches work seamlessly. The tray tool is a Windows tool, though, so it doesn't work on Linux or Mac. So on Mac, the clipboard approach works, and the Rider approach works with the extension, but the tray tool doesn't. And also on Mac, if you're on VS for Mac, you can't install ReSharper in that, so you can't have the extension in there. So there's a bit more limited support on Mac and similar caveats on Linux. So what I need to do is rewrite that tray tool to be cross-platform so that the same seamless experience and all of the options work on all the different operating systems. So that will be a challenge though, because I'm not overly familiar with cross-platform
Sure.
UI development.
Well, hopefully, in the .NET 6 wave and future versions of .NET, desktop clients are more and more, desktop clients across different platforms are more and more readily available, right? Like for instance, with Maui, maybe you'll get some sort of availability for, Mac clients.
Yeah, I am hoping that
Yeah.
does happen. And I am following what they're doing with Maui. So hopefully that makes it a lot easier to get that working. Because converting an old school Windows Forms app, um, you basically got to throw everything away on the UI side and just rewrite it to run anywhere else.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to speak whether Windows Forms should still be developed like new feature work, but I mean, if you're stuck there, please take advantage of the things that .NET Core can do for you. But maybe look at Maui as an option too if you can rewrite.
I did. I initially went with Windows Forms for the tray tool um, because it's something you're running in memory resident all the time on your dev machine. Well, that's how I do because I use snapshot testing in my day job. And a basic Windows format starts blindingly fast and uses hardly any memory. Um, and for the stuff I was doing, it just all works. I know it's considered legacy by many, but yeah, it just works.
Oh, I mean, when there's a reason why Windows Forms are still used and built as much as they are, right? Like to your point, things are increasingly fast. Building them is very, very straightforward. Like the designers inside of Visual Studio and in ReSharper are great, right? I'm sorry, yeah. And I think basically it's find the right tool for the job you're trying to do, right? Like, do you need to bring down 400 DLLs to be able to write like a little tray? Probably not, right? But I think it's one of those things that if you want cross-platform, you're going to have a whale of a time, right?
Anyway, I do want to loop back to one more thing. So one of the differentiating factors of Verify is its concept of effectively anything that can be serialized. So when you think of what we talked about earlier, where you are verifying an instance of a .NET class, so person, it serializes that to JSON, and you have a JSON file to as your snapshot. So when you think about that at a high level, you are serializing something to a format on disk that can be compared by tools and compared by the eyeball. So if you apply that concept to a bunch of other things, let's say you want to snapshot test a Windows form. You pass a Windows form or a Windows control to Verify, and it will convert those things to PNGs, and then that's your snapshot file. If you want to verify a PDF, you pass a PDF to Verify. It will, for each page, split out and write PNGs for each page, and it will also give you a metadata JSON file that contains all the metadata for PNG. And for that one test, you now have one test can map to multiple snapshot files. So for one PDF test, you now have n number of snapshot files, one for the metadata and one for each page. If you want to snapshot test a web page, you can pass in a URL to Verify or an instance of what's it called? A Playwright page, and it will convert that to the HTML as well as a PNG rendering of that page. And that's your two snapshot files for that test. So you can see that paradigm can apply to almost anything. Anything you can serialize to one or more files is a good candidate to snapshot test.
That's great. I mean, I think that's very, very valuable, right? especially when you come to think about like validation testing for anything, whether like, being able to compare screenshots of pages or rendered HTML of pages or being able, like, I think this concept allows a lot of people to, have an easier ability to fall asleep at night because you have the ability to understand that if my builds pass, that's great. But it's not just my builds passing and my tests passing. It's also like, what are my functional tests? Are they going to pass, right? And I think that's really, really valuable. And I'm glad that Verify is there for folks.
And because it commits those files to source control, you have this very interesting side effect happen where um, looking back through history or the previous versions or changes between two versions, you can now go down to each commit and say, we did this commit and how did that change the look and feel of the web page at that time? So it's much easier to understand what a code change has done when you can see this is how it changed the web page or the header or whatever else. And it also allows you to communicate much better with business owners in that regard because you can go back through time or look at any given change and you can show them for this scenario, this is the change we did, and this is how the page changed as a result of that change. Right? You don't need to wait for it to be deployed and have them click, click, click and get down to the actual page and look at it and review it. You can actually point them to a diff in source control and say, you requested that the font gets bigger. Here's the exact diff, and you can see the before and the after. Is that correct? Right. So you have these kind of flow-on effects to all these different parts of your business where like they don't know what snapshot testing is, but suddenly you're surfacing this information at a much higher level that you can communicate with. It's a strange side effect that happens. Like, you don't need to teach people about it. It just happens.
Yeah, I mean, just the concept of being able, because unfortunately, like humans can't tell all the subtle differences in two images if they're very similar, right? But machines can very, very well, right? So being it like, for instance, if you make a change and a button gets moved over like 5 pixels, like most human eyes aren't going to be able to detect that. But those 5 pixels moving that thing over might be a problem, right? So being able to continuously compare against versions that are verified is really valuable. I think one of the things as we're wrapping up is I'd like to talk with you about, you know, the community and how, folks, if they see Verify, maybe they're users of it and they want to contribute, what's the best way for them to go about doing so?
So jump on the GitHub page and raise a feature request, start a discussion. All of that stuff's enabled. Also, I'm on Twitter and happy to be reached out to. And also snapshot testing isn't common in .NET. I wouldn't say, like, I think a few % of projects use it. There's probably 6 different snapshot testing libraries in .NET that are currently in active development, and all of those people are happy to be reached out to, and I have done so on social media or in GitHub repositories, and we've shared ideas and pulled different things back and forth. So the different libraries are kind of leveraging off things they've learned and applying them in their own paradigm. So the community there is very, very open to people coming in. But yeah, reach out to me any way you want to, and yeah, I'll happy to have a chat. I regularly do offers on Twitter of if anyone wants to get started on snapshot testing, I'm happy to jump on a call and walk them through it. One of the challenges of snapshot testing is you often have to see it in action to understand it properly and understand the value, and getting that flow correct is difficult the first time you do it. You don't quite grok it until you've done it 3 or 4 times or someone explains it to you as you're walking through. So if anyone wants to get on a call with me, I can show you samples. I can help you get started in your own project. Just let me know.
That's great. I really appreciate you coming on here and chatting with us about Verify. So, folks, if you feel like your testing framework, if you're testing projects, if you could, level up them in a way that allows you to get that more high fidelity comparison of what's verified and what's not, please check out Verify. So, Simon, I want to thank you so much for hopping on and saying hello. And for everybody checking out this page, be sure to check out the Verify GitHub repo and all the other assets. So I'm Isaac Levin, my friend Simon here. Thank you so much, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks.